Welcome to the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long-term business survival and success is dependent upon creating maximum profits. That only happens when you can first create a people-first culture. And we have a podcast series that goes twice a month on that subject. We bring you experts that are doing it or helping us do it. So some of us do it successfully, some of us are still working on it, but we want to share with you what's really going on. Today, we have Dr. Ryan Lahti with us, and he's the founder and managing principal of OrgLeader, where he works with C-suite executives, division presidents, heads of corporate business functions, to how they optimize and lead their organizations, especially, and you're going to hear a lot about this today, when they're confronting uncertainty and risk. Ryan is the author of Finesse Factor, How to Build Exceptional Leaders in STEM Organizations. He's a sought-after speaker. He's been featured on NBC Today, inside Forbes Councils, a variety of publications, including Fast Company, CIO, Authority, and as well as being a contributor to Forbes. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. And just to clarify, I wasn't on NBC Today. It was NBC, but not today. I'd like to be on today, but not yet.
Well, hopefully this will be that lever that gets you there.
I appreciate it.
So I'd love to have you just start giving us a little bit of your background. And as you're building your background, focus on why you focus on uncertainty and risk. You know, how that became, the focus of your practice.
Sure. As far as what I do, I help leaders thrive on uncertainty and better manage risk, as you mentioned. And let me just clarify what I mean by that. By uncertainty, I mean a situation you've never encountered before, or a similar circumstance where something new has been added, which makes it uncertain. And of course, anytime you have uncertainty, you have risk, because if you mishandle that situation, it could quickly go sideways on you or have the opposite effect of what you intend. As far as what that looks like, we all face different forms of that every day, and leaders especially do. So it could be anything from taking on larger roles and responsibilities. It could be trying to figure out how to motivate and retain top performers. It really depends upon the situation in the organization.
When I think about what you just said and thinking about leaders I know, often the uncertainty and risk, they just jump up. I mean, they show up today. We're in lockdown. Inflation went up again. I lost my best person. How do you work? I mean, what's the relationship that you have with these leaders so that when things change and all of a sudden they're in that uncertain place, you can help them?
Well, let me clarify a little bit more. So when I work with them, I'm trying to help them look at uncertainty and risk a little bit differently. You can't eliminate uncertainty, but you can control its impact by how you respond. And of course, by doing that, it helps you to manage risk. So since we're talking about uncertainty and risk, what I really do is I help them to develop really two types of essential capabilities. One deals with what they think about and process on their own prior to and during those situations involving uncertainty and risk. And then the other type deals with how they relate to others as they handle the uncertainty and risk.
And I'm guessing that has a huge impact on the organization.
It does, absolutely does. When you're developing these type of capabilities, they are a key element that helps to create that motivating work environment where people want to be and stay. So I'm an organizational effectiveness guy, but I work a lot with leaders because of their impact on organizational performance. So when we're talking about that, we know that the impact the leader has. For example, from work dating back to 1960s at Harvard, we know that over 50 to 67% of what people experience as a work environment is due to the approaches leaders use every day. I mean, Gallup even a little further found that about 70% of the variability in employee engagement across business units is due to leadership. So leadership has a huge impact on the work environment, which of course impacts organizational performance more broadly. And the other thing I would point out is, when you have those type of work environments where It's more inspiring. It helps to create this place where people have the opportunity to perform better. And of course, employees feel more appreciated, customers feel more appreciated, but even more than that is the impact that it has from a business standpoint as well. So companies with those type of work environments have shown over a 680% increase in revenue and over a 900% increase in stock price over an 11-year period. So said differently, that's 4 times the revenue and 12 times the stock price of companies that don't have that type of work environment.
Wow. Wow. I know you're a data guy. So when I hear that, first I want to get some of it, but then I want to know how do I measure it, and how do I, over that period of time, keep getting better? Because I'm sure that that's part of it. It's not just can I manage the risk today, but it's how do I manage it, I guess throughout my career.
Well, a couple things. So those 2 types of essentials that I was referring to, there are really 7 that fall into those 2 categories of those 2 types. And just to give you an example, some of the ones that are more related to what you think about and process on your own prior to and during those tricky situations, the leaders that are handling uncertainty and risk very well, they would take the time to consider the type and severity of the situation, who's in it, who's impacted by it, who can influence it, and how do they do so. That's really about reading the situation and the stakeholders. The next thing they typically would do is think about, well, what am I bringing into that situation in terms of strengths that can help me with the uncertainty and risk, or limitations that can get in my way. And that's really about leveraging self-awareness. And then they use those 2 in combination to try to come up with strategies or approaches that are more likely to produce the outcome they're looking for. And that's really about anticipating the impact. So that gives you a flavor of some of those essentials. But how do you measure those? Well, you can measure those down to the behavior level. I'm a business person and industrial organizational psychologist by background. So I have built an assessment tool that will measure those elements down to the behavior level. So you can pinpoint strengths and limitations and then track your growth and progress over time.
As you're describing this, I'm imagining an organization where the leadership team, for example, all understands those kinds of, I guess, opportunities and risk areas and can communicate together. Is that a real thing, that you get a team that is aware of the kinds of things you're teaching?
You can, and a lot of my work, not only just one-on-one with executives and board members, but also with executive teams. So that work would involve working with each one of those team members one-on-one, but also with a team as a whole to help them progress down the path of becoming more effective or more of a high-performing team. So the type of organizations that I work with, as I mentioned, are primarily STEM. So those driven by science, tech, engineering, and math. That's probably about 89% of my work. And the large reason I focus on those is because of, if you think about a typical week, STEM organizations impact us more than we realize. From what you do, where you go, how you get there, and how you're made able to do so. All those relate to STEM organizations. I mean, you and I having this conversation right now, we're using tablets, computers, semiconductors, software. Those are all STEM organizations in tech space. So that's where I specifically focus the most. But I especially work with those organizations and leaders that are really wanting to create long-term value by methodically engaging all stakeholders around a common purpose. And you and I both know that's probably better described as stakeholder capitalism.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I know a lot of people, it's hard to let your teammates know you feel there's a risk here, that you got to be a little bit vulnerable. And if you have the whole team going through this, I would assume that makes people much more confident and even be able to get support from each other.
You do, and I think the key piece there is helping them first. All the work that I do typically starts out with establishing a baseline. So as you mentioned, I'm a data guy. So we're going to establish a baseline on those capabilities I just referenced to see, okay, where are you at? What's your starting point? Where do you want to get as an individual, but as well as a team? And then we map out, okay, so what are the actions that you're going to take? what are the metrics we're going to use gauge progress, and then also ensure accountability.
Do you ever work in sales organizations?
Periodically, I do. So it really depends upon what the issue is and who's really wanting the help. So yes, I do work a lot with STEM, but it could be any part of a STEM organization.
Because particularly in enterprise selling, where you're doing transactions that can be million or millions, there's so much risk on every side. There's career risk for the salesperson, and you want to make sure that you are ethically and with integrity communicating to the client. The client's asking you for all kinds of things, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty and risk going on. Do you have any way to have organizations support their selling teams that way? Would they work with?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, would they be your client?
They could be. Again, it depends on what is the driving issue they're trying to address, and that's really the starting point. Is it really more of a process issue? Is it more of an individual capability issue? And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, it starts out with using an assessment to establish a baseline. Let's gauge what is the underlying issue, and then we determine what is it we're trying to produce, and then we develop the action plan for doing so, along with metrics to gauge progress along the way.
Yeah, I want to read from one of your articles in Forbes, and our work is all around how do we create a great culture. And this really struck me when I read it. So just hang with me for a second. It's how do exceptional leaders handle these challenges? Exceptional leaders distinguish themselves from counterparts by the way they recognize the type of situation and successfully respond to it. Genuine success is defined by how their response impacts the work environment and the individuals in it. When I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, that's where we see all the problems showing up, where there are leaders who don't recognize the impact of what it is they're doing. What advice or insights do you have for us in that space?
Well, a couple of things. I think a lot of times leaders don't make the distinction between intent versus impact. So intent is what you aim to do. Impact is what people actually experience. And ideally, those two should be aligned, but frequently they are not. So that usually goes back to one of two issues to some degree. Either their recognition or willingness. So either they don't know what they don't know, or they're unaware that they lack self-awareness, or they could be aware of it, but they're just choosing not to do anything about it. That's a willingness issue. So again, the starting point is usually trying to help them understand, here's how you're coming across. Is that really what you want to do? If it's not, then let's figure out what is your impact you're wanting to have, and come up with approaches and different methods and ways to help you build these capabilities so you can in fact have that impact.
Interesting. It sounds like you help people take control of their careers.
That's a key piece of it, because some of these behaviors, if they're not managed well, can be career limiting. So that's often some of the calls I get is, we have these sharp leaders, they're very good at what they do, but they have some rough edges that if they don't refine them, that could get in their way and they may plateau in terms of their career.
Yeah, interesting. Another thing that comes out of that particular article is you talk about tricky elements. Mm-hmm. I love the title. Why don't you share what tricky elements are and tell us about how we either take advantage of them or avoid them, depending on the situation.
Well, the tricky elements that I was referring to in that article are really two types, the uncertainty and risk piece. So uncertainty, as I shared with you before, is really about, a situation you never encountered before, or something that's similar, but there is something new that's been added to it. So it could be a situation where you're in a lot of meetings with an executive team, when working with an executive team, but the last quarter's financials were not very good. So that element could impact how the team interacts with each other and with you. And that financial performance could be the new element in the meetings, even though you've been in a variety of other meetings before with these. And that will definitely impact how the team interacts with each other and with you. And I've actually experienced that. So that's an actual example. The risk piece is, well, how do they handle that uncertainty? Do they throw each other under the bus? Do they work collaboratively? How do they work with the organization overall? How do they share the results and the reasoning or what happened regarding that financial performance, if that's the case? And then how do they respond to it? It's a perfect opportunity to show the leaders in the rest of the organization, this is how we handle adversity. How do they want to handle that? It's a great opportunity to do it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Interesting. As you're explaining, and I'm just thinking about the world we live in today. I mean, it sounds like you get a tricky element about every 2 weeks or something that is significant.
You probably have them more even frequently than that. So having talked with leaders and asked them that specific question, they've shared with me they deal with them on a daily basis. So it could be speaking truth to power, it could be diffusing conflict, it could be leading digital transformation, it could be figuring out how to work in a hybrid work environment, it could be dealing with COVID. It takes a variety of different forms. So the situation will vary by organization.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes it even clearer. Now I'm going to kind of jump directions. How do you see organizational purpose show up in your work, and how does that fit into this risk and the kind of work you do?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm an organizational effectiveness guy. And I alluded to, I'm also a believer in stakeholder capitalism. And I define that as, seeking long-term value by methodically engaging all stakeholders around a common purpose. So in my world, if you look at, and I know there's been a lot of skeptics that aren't really fans of stakeholder capitalism. They believe it's a fad or some sort of government influence or possibly an overly idealistic response to global events like climate action and the pandemic. But if you take the time to look at what stakeholder capitalism really is objectively, you'll see those descriptions really aren't accurate. And when businesses, or the Business Roundtable, I guess that was back in 2019, the CEOs on that took the time to sign the revised version of the statement of the purpose of a corporation. They all committed to leading organizations that benefit all stakeholders. So the reason I'm talking about this, though, because that relates to purpose. So each organization defines its own purpose. In the case of a healthcare or med device company, it could be, helping to cure illnesses or improve the quality of life of patients or the larger population. So when the Business Roundtable signed that pledge back in 2019, that got a lot of press. And I think a lot of people thought, well, that was kind of the catalyst for stakeholder capitalism. It really wasn't. That concept has been around for a while. And actually, the person who's most credited for that concept is Klaus Schwab, when he founded the World Economic Forum over 50 years ago. So why I think that's important is because in addition to him, there are a variety of business luminaries and organizations that contributed principles that are fundamental to stakeholder capitalism, which is about purpose. And if you look at the work of Ed Deming, his work on quality management, he was looking at how to meet the needs of internal and external customers. If you look at the work of Peter Drucker, he's looking at customer satisfaction, innovation, social responsibility, worker development, all as companies build their financial strength. And there are even companies or organizations like the B Lab, who certifies B corporations who meet rigorous standards related to social and environmental requirements as they build their profit. So I'm pointing that out because that term has been around for a while, but it's only more recently that we're seeing larger companies talk more about it. And those that have put some of those principles into practice, we've seen the performance results that come from that. For example, If you look at the most recent edition or list, Barron's America's most sustainable companies, the 100 firms on that list produce their shares from companies on that list produce returns that surpassed or exceeded the S&P 500. And if you look at, I think the US large cap index, which tracks Russell 1000 companies that demonstrate business behaviors that Americans believe are important for serving all stakeholders, that index has consistently beat the Russell 1000 benchmark since it started being traded in 2016. So purpose has a big impact. And I think more and more companies are seeing that purpose and profit are linked.
Amen. You know, I'm listening, I love that data. I'm glad you're a data guy. When you were talking about the tricky elements, it seems to me that purpose, you know, your commitment to your purpose makes handling tricky elements easier. Yeah. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and let me go back to my view of things as from an organizational effectiveness standpoint. I look at stakeholder capitalism as just a good way of increasing organizational effectiveness. You know, setting aside all the critics that say it's government influence or something else, which isn't true. Stakeholder capitalism, if you look at it from an OE or org effectiveness standpoint, and I define OE or org effectiveness as setting and accomplishing the right objectives with the right resources in the right way. And if you look at stakeholder capitalism using that terminology, the right objectives involve long-term value and a common purpose. The right resources are all stakeholders. And the right way is putting in place the appropriate strategy, structure, and process, along with metrics to gauge progress and ensure accountability. So they are very much related. And as far as you know, the whole long-term value, shareholder return is not the only part of long-term value, because yes, that's important, but the organization benefits from long-term value, as do everybody's impacted by the organization, whether they are customers, employees, you know, community members, or parties or individuals anywhere along the supply chain. So you're wanting to build that, have that positive impact both inside and outside company walls.
Okay, got a question for you I never dreamed we were going to talk about.
What's that?
As I'm listening, one of the things that always, as an observer, kind of surprises me, and that is we bring in a new leader, whether it's a CEO or head of sales or whatever the leader is, and we look to them to bring the new purpose or the new direction or the new strategy. And I'm always trying to figure out, should the organization have a cultural strategy purpose in place, and then we bring in leaders to make that value real and transferred? Or do we bring in people and change it all the time? And how does that show up in your work? Or does it?
Well, in my work, yes, the senior executive team, including the CEO, helps to create and implement the strategy, but the board is also involved there too. The board would primarily take the time to help set more the broader strategic direction, and then the executive team is much more about refining and executing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
And then purpose would be a part of that.
But should purpose transcend the current leadership group?
Say more. Couldn't quite hear you.
Yeah, should purpose change when we change leadership groups, or should purpose be ongoing?
I think purpose, again, that's why if you're having the board involved as a critical piece of defining the broader strategic direction, which would include elements of the purpose, whether you bring in a new CEO or another CEO, that's not going to shift that much, if that makes sense.
No, then that's my observation is the employees, you know, the mass of the employees, if they're there for the purpose, when you get a new CEO who wants to, you know, twist it a bit, it seems like you get a lot of tricky elements going on at that point.
You do, and I think let me go back to talking about creating that work environment, because you talk about a people first culture, and I agree with you 100% on that. When you're talking about creating that work environment where people want to be and stay, there are a number of elements that impact that. Of course, leadership being a huge one, as I gave you those statistics a few moments ago. But another one is balance. So balance in two ways. What is the balance that an employee has between work concerns and personal concerns? For example, if they have a sick spouse or child or parent, how much flexibility do they have to help that individual? Can they do more remote work in order to do so? So that's balance in the first way. The second form of balance is the balance between purpose and profit. What is the individual's view and what is the organization's view of that balance? How much in alignment are they? And the more those are in alignment, the more likely that the employee feels that they belong there. Again, there are other elements that tie into that too, but I think when those are out of alignment is when you see more frustration. Okay, the organization may just be focused on profit and profit primarily. Well, if the employee is saying, well, profit's important, of course we want the organization to be around for a while, but if you're really not addressing these other issues that are important to the employee as well, what are you doing for customers, suppliers? How do you support your local community and broader ones as well, environmental, et cetera, of the entire gamut of ESG and stakeholder capitalism, then you have some issues. A couple other elements that I would highlight in terms of the work environment. So as I mentioned, leadership's another one. So how well do the leaders, coach, empower? How well do they provide recognition and performance feedback? How well do they help employees handle uncertainty and risk? How well do those leaders, actually demonstrate corporate values versus just talk about them? The next one you might be thinking about is, well, what are the opportunities that the employees have from, jobs, roles, and assignments? So what, informal roles can they take as a part of their current job? Maybe it's leading a new initiative, or what are some short-term assignments they could take? Maybe it's launching a new product. And then what are new jobs even beyond that they could take? And then after that, you get into, well, what are the tools, resources, and support that employees receive, including compensation and benefits, that help them to do their work and sustain themselves? And then, of course, one of the other ones is, what are the learning and development methods that employees have to develop their capabilities and continue to develop their capabilities? That works hand in hand with the opportunities one. They have learning and development methods to build their capabilities, and then they can apply those capabilities in those opportunities, the jobs, roles, and assignments, to further refine them. So just some elements that play into that work environment, that people first culture as well.
Very, very interesting. The one thing we haven't talked about, or the one stakeholder we haven't talked about, are the customers. Mm-hmm. And when we think, when we define a revenue culture, we define it as customers are included, the ideal customers who want to partner with us and who actually help us get direction, based on what problems they're trying to solve and how they need us to be, their long-term player in that. In the work, when you talk about uncertainty and risk and the leadership work you do, how do customers play into it?
Well, it's a piece of, if you're a believer in purpose and profit working together, or in stakeholder capitalism, you're listening to what their needs are as well. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're providing the products and services they're looking for, but what else is it that they're looking for as well? How well do you treat both people inside and outside your organization is a big part of what we're talking about in creating that positive impact. So not just looking at customers as a dollar sign, but looking to them as collaborators as well.
Yeah, one of the things that always seems to make things cloudy is time frame. Mm-hmm. And we often think, well, what the customer needs right this minute is this, and we'll get to sell it, and that'll make our number for the quarter. But sometimes those short-term decisions don't help our long-term. How do we factor those things in?
Well, I think it's a difference in looking at it as a transaction versus a relationship. So I think the one you're talking about is short-term gain. It's a transaction. The leaders in organizations that are probably more effective at sustaining themselves and sustaining performance over time is they focus more on the relationship, not just the transaction.
I'm going to switch gears here on us again.
Mhm.
You were talking about how today there's a growing recognition of the importance of purpose and how we think about our business. What do you see the next, say, 5 to 10 years progression? Is it going to be similar or different, or do you see trends come? I mean, again, you're a data guy, so do you see trends in the data that as leaders or employees we should be thinking about?
Well, a couple things. So I think the last few years we're seeing, as I may have mentioned before, more large companies getting interested in purpose and profit, stakeholder capitalism, conscious capitalism, whatever term you want to put to that. And you will see, I mentioned the Business Roundtable, but there's been work by other entities as well that not only made those ESG practices more prevalent, but also provided ways to measure them on a consistent basis. So back in, I think, late 2019, 2020, you had the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum, made up of over 100 plus executives from companies around the world. They actually partnered with the big four accounting firms, EY, KPMG, PwC, et cetera, to provide a way so that corporations could make comparisons within and across industries as it relates to ESG requirements or expectations. And in fact, in 2020, they released stakeholder capitalism metrics that serve as the world's first standardized key performance indicators when it comes to ESG. So the other thing I would note is what I haven't seen in the past, but I'm seeing more recently. You have financial institutions, private equity firms like BlackRock and State Street, who are now talking more about stakeholder capitalism and ESG requirements or practices. And it's interesting because you didn't hear that many years ago, but you're hearing it much more now. And in fact, those same organizations are looking for more of those practices in their own operations, as well as the operations of companies in their portfolios, largely because they believe those ESG practices not only predict, but enable better long-term performance.
Is part of that kind of the change of the guard from my generation going away and the younger generations caring more about giving back to the community and doing something important, or isn't there data to support that?
It could be. I don't have any data to support that personally, but it very well could be. That makes a lot of sense, given how whether you're talking about Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and beyond. I think there is a shift more towards that direction. But I don't personally have any data to support that. I'm sure it's out there. I just don't have it readily at hand.
Okay. So my last question for you, because this has been a hoot for me. So tell me what advice you have for first senior executives when we're thinking about they're utilizing purpose to help them manage risk and uncertainty, and then what they should be thinking about for their careers. Not a real specific question, but what kinds of things should they be learning or trialing or being curious about going forward? And then the same question, but for younger people who are starting their career, how do they use the things you've learned about how to be a healthy, a well-rounded employee going forward? What should the people starting their careers be thinking about and willing to explore?
Well, you threw a lot of me there, so let me try to take them one at a time as best I can. So I would say to both, lead with resilience. So if you're really wanting to focus on, and since I'm an OE guy, driving organizational effectiveness with purpose and profit, or stakeholder capitalism, said another way, it's not enough to just be shrewd and agile. You need to develop the right capabilities that will enable you to address those uncertain situations, those risky situations in a steadfast manner, no matter what form they take. And once you do that, you're able to thrive. So it's really more about the way you carry yourself, as well as understand process and skillfully perform in tricky situations. And it's most evident by the way you show up and respond. So as far as the other elements I would suggest is, back up any commitments with substance. So if you are, trying to produce that long-term value, it'll be harder to achieve and maintain unless you put in the appropriate strategy, structure, and process to support that, and have metrics to gauge progress and ensure accountability. And then the last thing I would say is, inspire action through belonging. So leaders aren't the only ones that inside the company walls that help move things forward in terms of purpose with profit. You have your peers, you have direct reports, you have other workers inside the organization who are vital allies. So I think it's just as important that you realize, in order to create that environment where people want to be and stay, how you support and nurture the success of your associates has a big impact.
Well, I love that, but the question that comes to mind as I was listening is, where do we go to get that? I mean, is there a curriculum? Are there universities that are more focused in that space than kind of the traditional, when I went to school? Where do I go to start that journey?
The journey on which one of those elements I just mentioned?
Well, you're talking about the capabilities that you need to, to develop. Where do I go to start to develop those capabilities?
Well, I have not seen any type of university courses. I mean, I obviously do that in working with my clients and customers as well. So absolutely do that with leaders and leadership teams. I've not seen a curriculum yet that addresses those type of issues. Hence why you and I are talking about it, and hence why I wrote the book about it.
And read books and take responsibility for your own career.
Absolutely.
Well, Ryan, this has been great. Any last words you want to leave with anybody?
Yeah, I would just say that as much as we would like things to be black and white when it comes to making decisions and taking action, uncertainty and risk will always create gray areas. So my recommendation is make your peace with that and just get better at finessing the gray areas.
See, I am thrilled to have this conversation today, because I believe if we don't develop that superpower of being able to figure out how to manage successfully through uncertainty and risk, we're just going to be sitting on the sidelines, hoping somebody brings us something. And that's not a good strategy.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you for joining us. And for the rest of you, thank you for being here today. We do this every 2 weeks, and we hope we'll see you the next time. Thanks.
I appreciate it.